Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. I'm Geraldine Gelt, Chair of the Shalom Bayit Board. As you know, in addition to providing support to survivors of domestic abuse, Shalom Bayit also educates Jewish youth about consent and healthy relationships. We're excited this evening to present you a snapshot of that work that is part of the program we call Love Shouldn't Hurt.
Hi, everyone. I'm Naomi Tucker, Founding Executive Director of Shalom Bayit, and I'm so happy that you all are with us. It's my pleasure to welcome the incredibly gifted leader of our Love Shouldn't Hurt youth program, Zephira Derblich-Milea. Zephira has been with Shalom Bayit for over 16 years. So as you can imagine, she has been a true partner with me for a long time. In 2005, she transformed our pilot youth education program into the nationally renowned Love Shouldn't Hurt, which was and is the first youth-led, youth-created Jewish teen dating violence program in the country. I'll let her tell you more about that in her own words in a moment, but I just want to say that Zephira is a truly phenomenal educator. And most impressively, in addition to being the brilliant brainchild behind our youth program, teens love her, which really is pretty much the best review anyone can get. For us here in the office, we all learn from Zephira every day because she embodies the very values that she teaches. So I'm super pleased to welcome Zephira Derblich-Milea. Let's give her a warm Shalom Bayit welcome.
Thank you so much, Naomi. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm so grateful that you are here and that you wanted to get a little snapshot of the work that we are doing with youth in our Love Shouldn't Hurt program. So let me tell you a little bit about the Love Shouldn't Hurt program. The Love Shouldn't Hurt program was started in 2002, actually by a college intern who, I wasn't there at the time, but the story, how it's been told to me, is my understanding is she looked at our mission, which is so important, and she said, we're not ever going to end domestic violence if we're only doing intervention. The intervention, supporting survivors is core and critical. And if we really want to see a world in our future where nobody needs an organization like Shalom Bayit anymore, we need to work to prevent that from domestic violence and domestic abuse and dating violence from happening in the first place. That was how the youth program was born. It's grown a lot in those years. I am really grateful for all the support of all of you to help the youth program thrive and continue to thrive. What do? We provide healthy relationships, education, and dating violence prevention, primarily for middle school students, high school students, and college students, usually working with our local Hillels. We work in 9 different counties. And in addition to supporting our youth in learning about consent and healthy boundaries and thinking about media and consent, we're also supporting youth allies, so parents and educators, because where are young people learning about relationships? From all of us. So we need to be talking about this as well. So I'm very passionate about the work that we do with parents and with educators about supporting our youth in creating a consent culture. That is the way that I like to think about the work that I do at Shalom Bayit and the work of our youth program. You might have heard that and thought to yourself, what's a consent culture? Well, not the culture we're currently living in. So I'm going to give you a definition of a consent culture. I'm going to put it in the chat for you, anyone who's visual. A consent culture is one in which the prevailing narrative of human interaction is centered around mutual consent and is normalized and condoned in popular culture. And I'm going to give you one example of how our culture is not that, and one that confuses young people. If you've ever watched any romantic comedy ever, almost every single romantic comedy has a very classic storyline. It's always a heterosexual couple, and the man or the boy asks the woman on a date, and she says no. And then he keeps asking, and she keeps saying no. And he keeps asking, and he keeps asking, and he keeps asking. His behavior doesn't actually change, other than he wears her down to the point at the very end of the movie, she eventually says yes. Maybe they even share a kiss. The music changes, so then the music tells us we're supposed to celebrate and be happy. Now, if you didn't know that legally sexual harassment, if you like, especially in the context of a school, If a teen is being asked over and over and over again on a date after she or he or they have said no, that is sexual harassment. And yet media is teaching young people that that is dating. So that's an example of one of the messages that young people are receiving that is confusing and that is not in line with a consent culture, the world that I want to see. So another way that I like to think of my work at Shalom Bayit through the Love Shouldn't Hurt program is I wake up every day and I think about, okay, today is another day that I'm going to work myself out of a job. What does that mean? Well, my intention with prevention is that I really do hope that someday Shalom Bayit is no longer needed, because all of our organizations, and there are many people represented here who are doing incredible work to help prevent domestic violence from starting in the first place. It's so important that if someone is going through a situation of abuse, that they have an organization like Shalom Bayit to support them. But wouldn't it be great if they never went through the abuse in the first place? I think that all of us on this Zoom could agree with that sentiment. So that is why I like to think of my work that way. That's something that I tell teens. I usually like to just say it and then ask them, what do they think it means? It's really neat to hear young people sort of translating that thought of what it means for someone to want to work themselves out of a job. And I really love watching their gears going as you state that. So I'm going to just keep on going. You're going to hear me talk a lot, but in a moment, I'm going to make this interactive. We're going to do a little piece of my program. But I do want to let folks know, if at any point you have questions for me or questions about our youth program, please go ahead and put them in the chat for Naomi. Naomi Tucker, our executive director, is going to collect all the questions and we will have time for them toward the end of our time together. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit more about what it is that young people are asking us for and what are they wanting. So as I said, they're hungry for information about healthy relationships and consent in a social media world that's filled with really confusing messages about consent, about relationships, about boundaries. So I gave you that example of romantic comedies. Another example, recently one that I heard about that I found quite disturbing, was finding out about a TikTok trend. And if you're not familiar with TikTok, that is a social media app that teens, not every single teen, but most teens are spending a lot of time on. And there's a new trend that was trending, which was encouraging boys to slap the asses or the butts of their teachers who were women. And this was a trend going around on TikTok. So there are so many things that are wrong with that, right? But that's another example of a message that young people are getting that is not in line with the consent culture that I believe all of us on this Zoom want us to be in. So one of the things I want to share with you before we launch into a little taste of our program is to give you a little story about the impact that our program has on youth. I could actually spend the rest of this time telling you stories about the impact Love Shouldn't Hurt has had on young people, but I'm just going to share one that was recent that really stood out to me. And anytime I'm sharing stories, I have permission to share. So last year, I facilitated a workshop for a large group of 9th graders on Zoom, and the workshop was focused on consent. One of the 9th grade girls asked to stay after to talk with me on the Zoom. We talked for 30 minutes. What were we talking about? She brought up a situation that she was dealing with in an online gaming community on Discord, for anyone who's familiar with it. She was on this online gaming community, and there was a group that had been created by a boy that she knew. In the group, there was another boy who was repeatedly sexually harassing the girls in the group. And so as a result, this young woman and all of her friends did not feel safe. This was a space where they were supposed to play and learn together, and they actually did not feel safe to do so because they were being sexually harassed. So what she had done before talking to me is she had talked to the boy who ran the group and asked him for his support as an ally to make change so that this boy would stop harassing him. The boy who ran the group wasn't interested in taking action and didn't do anything about it. So she came to me to ask for advice. What we did is we talked first about what were the issues, what were the consent and boundary violations that were happening. And then we went through a whole list of options of things that she could possibly do. So, and she thought it through and she's like, I'm not sure yet what I want to do, but I'm going to think about it. 2 weeks later, she came back to me to tell me what had happened. And it was immediately apparent that something had changed because of the way her face lit up. And she said, Zephira, I'm so excited to tell you, because of our conversation, I felt like I could do this. So I really saw how our conversation in the workshop empowered her to then, what did she do? She created her own group. She said, this guy is not supporting me. He's not making this a safe space. I'm going to create my own space. She became the admin of a new online gaming group where she invited all of her girlfriends and any of the other all gendered folks who wanted to join, who wanted to be in a space that was all about gaming and fun and play. And I just absolutely loved that story. I loved how excited she was to tell me about it. And just for anyone who ever was in an environment, I had a class in school where I was being sexually harassed, and I did very poorly in that class. If we don't have a safe learning environment, how can we learn, right? Learning environments need to be safe. Play environments need to be safe. So that is one of my favorite stories. And I hope I get to run into her again. One of my favorite things that happens sometimes is I run into students when they're like in college, or even I just had a rabbi reach out to me and she said, Zephira, I remember when you taught me when I was in Midrashah in a high school program. And now here I am. I want to bring my program to, she's at a school, at a Hebrew high school in Los Angeles. So those are the stories I love. That's the impact of the Love Shouldn't Hurt program. So let's give you a little taste of what Shalom Bayit and what Love Shouldn't Hurt is doing to help create a consent culture and to help prevent sexual harassment. Well, one of the tools that we found that is the most effective for prevention is learning about healthy boundaries. And I'm going to do a little poll really quick, informally. A lot of you are not on camera, so you can use your reactions or not. But either like wave your hand or give me a thumbs up if you formally, as a young person, learned about healthy boundaries. If anyone formally taught you about healthy boundaries. Oh, Liana, this is so great. Now, Liana, I think went through a Love Shouldn't Hurt program.
It was you.
I didn't even plant her in the room. So, okay, I think unless I missed someone, the only person I saw raise their hand was Liana. So, and maybe one other person. So that says a lot, right? So we're not learning about this. I wish too. I wish I had that as well, Joanne. I had to teach myself. I'm actually one of the gratitudes I have for Love Shouldn't Hurt. It helped me have healthier boundaries because I had to learn how to teach other people about it. So we're going to launch into a little bit of a sampler of a piece that I do about healthy boundaries. But before we do, I just want to say that everything that I say in this space, you have my permission to share outside of this Zoom. I know we are recording this, but I am going to ask that if anyone says anything personal or private, that we would keep this between all of us on this Zoom. We're going to make sure you have ways to reach out to Shalom Bayit afterwards if you ever wanted to talk to somebody privately about anything going on in your life, or if you know someone who could use some support from Shalom Bayit. So let's dive in. What are boundaries? So I'm actually going to ask a Zoom a question, which is pretty radical because we'll see if anyone actually is willing to unmute. You can either unmute or answer me in the chat. What's a boundary? Just like in general, how would you define that? What's a boundary? Don't worry about getting it just right. Just when you think of a boundary, what is a boundary?
A line that shouldn't be crossed.
A line that shouldn't be crossed. So, and in the context of a relationship, it's a line that we've decided for ourselves in a relationship we wouldn't want crossed. Now, when we're talking with young people, especially high school and above, we're talking about the spectrum of peer relationships. So we're not just talking about romantic and dating relationships, we're talking about friendships too. One of the things I point out to people is that most of us in our lives will have more friendships than dating relationships. And friends are really important relationships, and they're a really great way to navigate and learn about healthy boundaries and healthy communication and how to have healthy relationships. So I'll give you a definition that I really like that Shalom Bayit uses to define boundaries. And I'm going to put it in the chat for our visual folks. So a boundary are limits that we determine for ourselves that protect our emotional and physical safety, our personal values, and our life goals. Or another way I say that sometimes for youth is our hopes or our dreams for ourselves. Okay, so boundaries are lines that I get to decide. They're my own. No one tells me what they are. They're mine. I get to decide. Often we might have similar ones, but we also might have different ones. And that's something that's important to note, that our boundaries might be different than our peers. So we have lines we wouldn't want crossed in our relationships. An example could be, I'm not comfortable with someone who treats me differently depending on who else is around. This is one that I often hear from teens. So like when I'm with my friends versus when we're alone, how am I being treated? So one of the things about boundaries that's so important is we need to be clear in our own minds about if and when we'll respond if someone violates our boundary, and how we want to handle ourselves when they do respond, or when we do respond. How do we want to have that moment? So we could spend hours doing a boundary program. We're not going to, so we're just going to do a little taste. So I'm actually going to ask everyone to, if you're comfortable, we're going to do a little interactive piece here. I'm putting into the chat a link to something called Padlet. If you've never used Padlet before, I'm going to share my screen right now, actually, so you can see what it looks like. So if you click on the link, this will come up for you. And at the bottom right, if you can see my cursor, I don't actually know if you, there's a little pink circle with a plus symbol. I'm asking you to fill in the blank at the top, or prompt. So it says, I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who. And as a reminder, those boundaries are things that are lines that protect our emotional and physical safety, our values, and our life goals. So anyone who is willing, and this is anonymous, so it's not going to be connected to your name, go ahead and click on the plus and fill in the blank. It'll give you an opportunity to write something, and then you'll hit, when you're done, publish. All right, it's already happening. Great. Oh, this is so great. I'm going to pause for a moment, but I just want to give one last instruction, which is please go ahead and start reading each other's. If something you see really resonates with you, one of the things that I love about this platform is that you can heart it. So far, all of them are resonating. So I'm going to quickly go around and try to heart all of them. But it's kind of a neat way to interact with each other. So I'm going to pause for a moment and be quiet just so that folks can take this in and take a moment to think about what are your boundaries. One of the ones I just read is who thinks they should have more power than I do, which just reminded me of something that we do at the beginning of all of our youth workshops is we define peer, because what we're talking about with youth are healthy peer relationships. So any of us in the Zoom who are parents, I hope that we all have really healthy relationships with our kids, especially if they're under 18. The reality is we have more power than them. It's not a peer relationship. So this prompt is thinking about healthy peer relationships. Yes, so I don't want to be in a relationship. I'm going to just highlight a few of them. They're so great. I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who engages in gaslighting. And if no one's familiar with that term, the way that I define that is gaslighting is getting someone's actions or words or behaviors are getting you to question your own reality. Question your reality. Even sometimes people use this term, I feel like I'm going crazy. And I don't use that terminology lightly, but that's often an experience that someone has when they're in a relationship where there's abuse, where there's a pattern of power and control. They feel like they're actually losing, their reality. I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who's not willing to grow as a person, who doesn't trust me, who puts me down to make themselves feel better, who yells to make me quiet, is contemptuous of things that are important to me, someone who never apologizes. I just pulled out a couple. There's so many great ones on here. So I'm going to pause for a moment, my talking, and ask, is there any of these that you wrote or you read that you want to comment on? Please either do so in the chat, or this would be that moment where I would encourage, if anyone feels comfortable, to unmute for a moment, and I want to hear from you. Is there anything that you saw, or maybe something that surprised you, or something you were like, it had some impact that you want to share with the group? Oh, I'm just going to keep talking unless you all interrupt me, because I just saw someone who doesn't respect my spiritual practices. And, that is one that we hear a lot about at Shalom Bayit, examples of, maybe someone who keeps Shomer Shabbos, who keeps Shabbat and doesn't, wouldn't drive on Shabbat, and their partner forcing them to drive, or forcing them to spend money, or something that would, or forcing them to eat pork or shellfish if they keep kosher. Someone who is a game player, that reminded me of a quote that I really like that I share with teens sometimes. I'll say it more than once just so you get it, but having a relationship with someone without trust is like having a phone without service. And what do you do when you don't have service? You play games. It's kind of a fun saying, but teens like it. So having a relationship with someone without trust is like having a phone without service. And what do you do when you don't have service? You play games. Right. Does anyone want to comment or share anything in the chat, or unmute yourself? Okay. With that, I'm going to keep us moving then. I'm going to stop the share. I want to thank you all so much for your participation. I'm going to leave that up for a while, so feel free to. You heard the recording? Great. Okay. Okay. So that boundaries, we just discussed boundaries. Some of those boundaries can sometimes be flexible, but there's another type of a boundary that we call a bottom line that are not flexible or open to compromise. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm actually going to define it first and put this in the chat. So the way that we define at Shalom Bayit bottom lines, there are types of boundary that we can assume people will know without us having to tell them. So they come from social or cultural norms or laws that already exist in our society. So an example of a boundary for me is I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't immediately tell me when they're having a problem with me. Well, maybe that's not how someone grew up communicating. So I need to tell them that's important to me. A boundary, a bottom line, I think we could all agree would be, for example, physical violence. That is something that I shouldn't have to tell someone not to hit me. That's something that is universally, for the most part, as a society, we've decided that is not okay. So when a bottom line is violated, even just once, that's usually a sign that that person or the relationship is unsafe. In addition to the flexible versus not flexible difference between boundaries and bottom lines, another difference has to do with that common social agreement. So that's just something that I really like to make sure young people understand, because one of the things about boundaries that's important to remember is they're unique to us. We need to communicate them because we can't expect people to be mind readers. I think that's a big problem in the world we live in with relationships, because people don't learn how to communicate openly and honestly and with direct communication. Often we expect people to be mind readers. And if we expect people to be mind readers, we're not going to actually get what we want or what we need in our relationships. So if someone were to cross a boundary we hadn't communicated yet, it's important to let them know. In fact, hopefully we'd all agree on this Zoom, that's an essential part of a healthy relationship. If something's happening in a relationship that's not quite working for you, tell the other person, right? But bottom line is usually something that shouldn't have to be communicated in advance. I really do want to encourage all of us, though, to think in advance about what are our boundaries and what are our bottom lines. Because that way, if someone crosses it, we're much more likely to recognize that it's being crossed. It's like a little alarm will go off in our mind and be like, ooh, something's not quite right. I need something to change. And then once we've told the other person we're in a relationship with that they violated our boundary, it's up to the other person to respond in a healthy, respectful way that shows they've heard you. And it's also their responsibility to state clearly what they're going to do to make sure that they don't cross that boundary again. So a boundary gets crossed, we tell the other person, and now it's up to them how they're going to receive it. Now, if on the other hand, they continue to ignore that boundary, even after you told them, that boundary can become a bottom line. It can become a deal breaker. Because once you've communicated it, now you're not expecting them to be a mind reader. If they continue to cross it, that's a conscious choice. Last thing I want to say that's so important about bottom lines and boundaries is if you don't feel safe to tell someone that you're in a relationship with that they crossed your boundary, that is a really important sign that the friendship or the relationship may be unhealthy or abusive. Because one of the essential parts of a healthy relationship is being able to communicate openly and honestly and with kindness and care. So the last thing we're going to do before we close, I'm going to introduce to you a way that a visual tool that I use for folks to think about boundaries. That's if we had lots of time, and any of you who are artsy, I'd encourage you to do this later, if you because we're not going to have time to do it right now. So the concept that I'm using is something called an eruv. What's an eruv? Does anyone know what an eruv is? Can someone unmute us? I'm going to put it's here on your screen. ERUV. Say that again.
A fence that surrounds a space.
Okay, great. So an eruv is actually a ritual enclosure that some communities construct in their neighborhoods as a way to allow observant Jews or visitors to carry objects out of their home on the Sabbath or like Yom Kippur. Berkeley actually has an eruv, if you didn't know. And so it's on the telephone lines. That's how it's. So it's a way. What is the purpose of an eruv? It's creating a ritual enclosure to create a safe space. It symbolizes and makes concrete a boundary for the community. So it creates an opportunity for intentionality. So at Shalom Bayit, with youth, we like to think of an eruv as a metaphor for creating a safe space for myself, where the rules are different. I get to decide what is in my space. Only certain things are allowed. There are things that I never want to have in my safe space, and I'm going to decide what it is. So what we ask young people to do is, in the beginning of our workshop, we've actually done a whole brainstorm about qualities that we want in a healthy relationship. So we're going to put that in our center, in our safe space. What are the qualities that are essential, that are like our must-haves, that we cannot live without? So for me, some of those are like communication, respect, trust, honesty. Those are some of my must-haves, essentials. I'm not willing to compromise. I need that. And then on the outer rim, our boundary, are going to put our boundaries. This is the section, this is like our outer safe space. This is the section for our boundaries that are a little more flexible. They're important to us, but they're not deal breakers. And then on the very outside this is outside of our safe zone. This is outside of the eruv. This is where we put our bottom lines and our deal breakers. These are the things that if were happening would not support our safe space. And now we're going to show you an example of what this could look like when it's completed. So we're going to go to our next slide. So this was, I have permission, but this was one that was created by a college student and I just love the visual. So this is something that if you think it's interesting, if you like it, I encourage you to do this on your own. And think about what are those essential must-haves. And for any of us in the Zoom who are parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles or, anything in between and outside, if you have any young people in your life, one of the questions I want you to ask yourself is, how am I teaching that young person in my life about the importance of that inner safe space and boundaries? How am I explicitly talking to the young people in my life about the qualities that are important to me in a healthy relationship? I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I do this regularly. I have also the benefit of, this is my work, but it is something I'm really passionate about. So we can leave the visual up for a moment, but I wanted to close us out. And I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat for Naomi. She's collecting them because we are going to have some time for questions. But I want to share with you a quote to close this out that just the other day, actually, I was at something for Jewish teen professionals. And there was a question sort of like, what's your 5-minute Torah? If you only had 5 minutes with a group of teens, what would you want to make sure that they walked away with? So I'm going to share with you, to me, my 5-minute Torah. It's not actually going to be 5 minutes, it's going to be even shorter. But what is like the one thing I would really want to make sure teens walk away with? And the message comes from this quote that's famous to a lot of us. So there was an ancient rabbi who lived thousands of years ago. His name was Rabbi Hillel. And he said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So what is the essential teaching that I pull out of this? If we had lots of time, we'd do a whole discussion, we'd do breakout rooms and everything, and we'd come back. But I'm going to give you my essential teaching that I love here. It's like the oxygen mask on an airplane. Not a joke, when I'm on an airplane and they talk about the oxygen mask, I say out loud, that's the Rabbi Hillel quote. Now, I want to just point out, when I ask teens actually about the oxygen mask, a lot of young people will say that you have to put on other people's masks before your own. So there's two problems with that. One, they're not listening to the safety instructions, which is a little concerning. So don't have them sit in the important aisle. But two, actually, is that comes from this culture that we live in, where we often, especially people who are socialized as girls, are taught to put other people's wants and needs and desires before our needs. But if you put on everyone else's mask first, you're going to be no help to yourself or anybody else. So one of the essential teachings I really want to make sure my 6-year-old and all the 6-year-olds and all the 12 and frankly, all of the 40, 50, 90-year-olds know is that we need to in a relationship, we need to figure out what it means to put on our own mask first. So to me, one of the key essential messages is learning my own needs and my feelings and how to communicate them in a relationship with someone else. And that we all deserve to be in relationships with people who care about our feelings and our needs and will support us in having a healthy relationship with ourselves. So that key teaching for young people is to think about, I like to think about healthy relationships with other people are supporting the relationship I have with myself. Because ultimately, I am the only relationship I have that is a guaranteed lifelong relationship. That's it. We all have one guaranteed lifelong relationship, and it's us, it's ourselves. So I encourage you to think about how you can teach the values from that text, from the values of healthy boundaries and healthy relationships to all the young people in our lives. And I want to thank you all so much for spending this time with me to think about this important topic and to learn a little bit with me in a format that's a little different than I usually do. So thank you so much. And we're going to take questions, but I do want to just make sure everyone knows that this program, the Love Shouldn't Hurt program, can be brought to schools far and wide. We primarily work in Jewish schools, but we also work in non-Jewish schools. So I just put a link in the chat to the prevention part of our website where you can learn more about our prevention program, Love Shouldn't Hurt. Thank you.
Zephira, thank you so much. I just always love hearing from you, even though, of course, I've been listening to you for 16 years, but never failed to impress. One question that is coming our way is, we talk a lot about the importance of not blaming the victim and putting the responsibility on perpetrators of dating violence and sexual harassment. So can you just say a few words about why teaching people to enforce their own boundaries is the right protective move? Like, how does that make a difference?
Around victim blaming specifically?
No, how does it make, I think the question is, why is teaching people to enforce their own boundaries a key tool for you in preventing
abuse?
Dating abuse. Yeah.
Great question. So, great. So one of the teachings that I would do in this moment, if we had more time, and probably at this point in a workshop, young people would already have learned about the way that Shalom Bayit teaches about relationships. We teach about relationships on a continuum. So on one end, there's healthy relationships. And as we move along, we get to a category called unhealthy, and on the other end, abusive, where there's a pattern of power and control. One of the reasons having healthy boundaries is such an important tool for preventing abusive relationships is a lot of the types of abuse, when it starts in a relationship, because relationships never start out abusive. I just think that's important to note. Otherwise, people wouldn't be in them. So usually when abuse starts, it can happen very subtly, especially for youth. It can be very subtle types of control. And one of the things I'll point out with youth is sometimes control can be masked in love. It can be presented as, oh, I'm only telling you to wear this particular thing because you're so beautiful and I know how people can take advantage of beautiful people. I'm presenting it in a way that seems really loving, but actually what's underneath it is control. Those subtle types of control are much easier to recognize if you know for yourself, where are your boundaries? Where are your lines of protection? Another reason it's really important, so it can help you recognize when a relationship is moving toward the abusive side, but another really key piece is, I mentioned that an essential part of a healthy relationship is being able to tell someone else if they've crossed your boundary. So how someone responds when you tell them that they've crossed your boundary can be an excellent indicator of the health of your relationship. So if I were to tell someone that they crossed my boundary and they responded like, "Oh, Zephira, thank you so much for telling me. This is what I understood that you just said. Here's what I'm going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future." That is an example of a really healthy response. If someone were to say to me, "You're being too sensitive. You always are like bringing up issues," or dismissing, minimizing, that's going to be maybe a red flag or warning sign that this relationship is not the healthiest. Or if someone were to, oh, thank you for telling me. I really appreciate you telling me. But then they keep doing it over and over and over again after you've told, "Oh, what do you mean? I don't even remember you told me." Remember gaslighting? Someone brought that up as a boundary. That if someone had decided for themselves, I don't want to be in a relationship where there's gaslighting, they're much more likely to recognize when that's happening. Whoa, I just told someone they crossed my boundary, and they're minimizing it, or they're denying it, or and again, I had said this before, but I want to emphasize, if you're in a relationship with someone and you don't feel safe or comfortable telling them that they've crossed your boundary, or if you've told them in the past and you've gotten abuse in return, whether it's verbal or emotional or physical or any type of abuse, sexual, that would be definitely a sign that the relationship is not healthy. So that is one of the reasons why I found, both from my life and from, this is something we also work in our direct services program. We teach our survivors in our support groups about healthy boundaries. And we consistently hear that this is a really great tool for a lot of these people as they've left abusive relationships, especially as they're thinking about dating again, that they can start to think about what are those lines of protection for themselves.
Thank you. Can you give us a couple of examples of the kinds of questions that teens ask you in your workshops?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that actually makes me want to give a plug to one of the services that Love Shouldn't Hurt offers is an ability for teens to ask questions. So I'm actually going to put that link in the chat for everybody too. And on this link, you can also find some of the answers to the questions. So teens can ask us anonymous questions during our workshops, and then we write written responses to them. So that's one of the services that our program offers. So some of the questions that we most commonly get are kind of like the number one question is, how do I help a friend? So if this is happening to someone I know, how do I help them? It's not intuitive to know how to help a friend. And that's one of the pieces of our core workshop. We have a whole section on how to help a friend if they're in an abusive relationship. I get questions about, why do people abuse? Why does this happen in the first place? Why would someone treat anyone this way? We get questions about, what do I do if this were happening to me or someone I know? How do I intervene for myself? And then we get some questions that are more specific about types of abuse. So thinking about how can people use technology to control someone else? We talk about the line between healthy texting your friend and texting your friend to check up on them and keep an eye on their whereabouts, or to be in control of their time or their actions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we just have a couple minutes left. So I want to, again, just invite people, if your question hasn't been answered, this is a Jewish audience, so please interrupt me and just go ahead and unmute and ask your question, especially if you're someone who's not super comfortable with the chat. We want to get everyone's questions in here. So I'm going to just pause for a second. I know that's not a common move for me. Okay. And I do want to ask you, Zephira, have you seen any change over time? You've been doing this for so long in teens' awareness of response to sexual harassment in particular?
There's definitely greater awareness. At some point that would be like an interesting conversation with Liana, our community outreach program director, who was in school a good 10 plus years after me in high school, to see how things have changed, and a part of starting BHS Stop Harassing, Berkeley High School Stop Harassing. Young people are just much more aware of issues in the world in a way that when I started this work in 2005, they were not. And that's really has a lot to do with social media and the internet and smartphones, the quick access to information. So young people were aware of Me Too, for example, in a way that I would not have been aware of Me Too if it were happening when I was in high school, because the internet made it so far and wide. What I'm finding just in the classroom, in the change that I've seen between 2005 and now, is when I would walk in a classroom in 2005, there was always an interest and excitement to talk about these issues. Now there's a level of understanding of the importance of it from young people that didn't exist before, if that makes sense. So there's like already when I walk in the room, the young people are like, yes, we need this. Because we see, so, you know, and bullying is a form of a pattern of power and control. It's different than domestic violence, but there are some similar elements to it. And that's something that was happening, you know, for I think probably all of us in school, but it's happening in a different way and a different level online. And more people are aware of it in a way that it's more public than it was before in some ways. And so these issues are just more at the forefront, I think, for young people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your last moment here, can you tell us about your work with parents and educators, and just give us a little snippet about what that's like?
Oh, yay. I'm so glad that you asked me that. This is, to me, really where the essential work. I mean, the work with teens is so important, but one of the things I like to point out to all, so I've got so many adults on the Zoom, so I'm very excited. I'm going to point out to all of you, how did you learn how to walk? Did somebody teach you? You learned to walk because you saw the older people doing it and you thought, that is so much more efficient than this crawling thing. I'm going to figure that out. And you figured it out. How do we learn about relationships? Did people teach us about relationships? They did, by having them. And we watched them. We watched them on TV. We watched them with our aunts and uncles, with our parents, our siblings. We watch relationships. We watch how we learn. That's how we learn about relationships. So this work with parents and educators, to me, is like some of the most critical work, because as we learned from the Zoom, only I think maybe one of us actually learned about healthy boundaries, and that was from the Love Shouldn't Hurt program. So if we didn't learn about this, how can we teach young people? So one of the pieces that I'm doing with parents is actually teaching them about healthy boundaries and consent. Let's all be on the same page about it, what it really looks like to be in a consent culture. But here, I'm going to give you my 5-minute tour. If I had one thing to say to all parents and teachers everywhere, one of the things that I think is really important for us as adults to think about is, how are we in our actions and behaviors really modeling a consent culture? So one example is, no means no. That's something that adults say all the time. It starts as soon as, you know, kids can move. We're like, no means no. If you ask teens, does no mean no in your life? They will say no. On a daily basis, young people are being asked questions by adults that are not actually questions, where they're not actually being given a choice. That is a very simple yet significant way that young people are learning about consent. When we say, will you take out the trash? That is not actually a choice. When my child was 3, I never asked her, will you get in the car seat? Because she would have said no. And then what was I going to do? Just drive with her sitting on the top of the car? No, right? So, but choice is important. So the example I gave with my younger child is, would you like to get in the car seat yourself, or would you like me to put you in the car seat? Choice is great, but we need to stop giving choice where there isn't choice. That's one essential change that a lot of people can make that I really want to encourage. One that I'm really excited, you know, in your question, Naomi, about what's changed with youth, one thing that I'm seeing that's changing in the parent world is there's more talks about not forcing children to hug or kiss family members or grandparents without consent, without their permission. And that's one that still I get pushback about, but more and more parents are saying, yes, this is important. And one of the reasons I think that's so important is, if a young person says, I don't want to hug someone because it makes them uncomfortable, and we say, oh, but you're going to disappoint them. The message we're giving them, even though it's not our intent, is your discomfort doesn't matter if someone else's feelings might be hurt. I'm going to say that again. Your discomfort doesn't matter if someone else's feelings might be hurt. And that message, as they get older, can translate in ways that are really quite problematic. So these are just some little snippets of things that we as adults can be thinking about and doing differently. If you're excited about this, if you want to learn more, you don't even have to be a part of a school. You can bring me in to do a program with a group of parents that, you maybe you have a group of peers that you like to get together. I've done workshops also for huge range of parent age groups. So I one time did a workshop. We had people who had kids who were babies all the way through in their 40s who were grandparents. So we had a whole spectrum. So I just really want to encourage folks to think about where's a place in my life that I could bring this type of education.
Zephira, thank you so much. You are an inspiration as always. I hope that all of you here with us this evening have found it enlightening to hear from Zephira. And I'm just so grateful to all of you for being with us tonight. You're really the people that sustain us and are part of the Shalom Bayit circle of life. So thank you for being here, for always being supporters of our work, and for helping us keep this going. And Zephira, thank you for the very powerful work that you are doing both with young people and with parents and educators. You're hearing you always gives me hope for the future about what young people are going to do that is improved with every generation. So thank you all. That's it for us for tonight. We really appreciate your being here. And we hope to be in touch with all of you soon. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you all so much. You all being here gives me hope. That's what I thought of when Naomi said that.
Well, Zephira, I still hope, even though this was so amazing, that you work yourself out of a job.
Thank you. Well, I didn't say it on here, but I usually do admit to teens that I like to be honest that I don't think that will happen in my lifetime. Just from what I've seen, a lot of changes happen, but I don't think that that will happen in my lifetime.
But we'll still keep working for it.
We're going to keep working at it.
All right. Thanks, you all. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good work.